In the winter of 1943, as Allied commanders intensified their air campaign against the heart of Nazi Germany, a lesser-known episode unfolded in the cold skies above the North Sea, an incident still studied quietly in military aviation circles. It began with a flight of B-17 Flying Fortresses from the U.S. 8th Air Force, part of a deep penetration bombing raid aimed at critical shipyards in Bremen. To most crews, the mission brief sounded familiar. Heavy flak expected, fighter interception likely, cloud cover uncertain. Yet buried in the mission report was a line that hinted at the extraordinary, visibility variable. Weather fronts merging over the Dutch coast. It was the kind of forecast that experienced pilots read twice. For the men aboard the 379th Bomb Group's trailing flight element, the uncertainty was palpable. These were crews who had already survived lethal runs over Schweinfurt and Wilhelmshaven. They understood better than anyone that a bomber formation was only as strong as its cohesion. Lose position, and a flying fortress became an easy target for Luftwaffe fighters or a vulnerable speck in the chaotic Northern European weather system. Even before takeoff at Kimbolton Airfield, ground crews recalled the uneasy silence among the airmen as they checked ammunition belts and oxygen lines, routine tasks overshadowed by the knowledge that Bremen's defenses were among the most feared in the Reich. As the formation pushed eastward, the first hours passed with relative calm. The fortresses maintained tight combat boxes, gunners scanned the sky, and the radio carried only brief navigational updates. But as the aircraft approached the Dutch coastline, the weather shifted with startling speed. A dense wall of cloud rose ahead, described later by one navigator as a gray continent unto itself. The lead elements prepared to punch through, but the trailing element, 3 B-17s flying slightly out of position, hesitated for only a moment. It was long enough to change the course of the entire mission. Inside one of those aircraft, the crew clipped into oxygen masks as turbulence shook the fuselage. Entering heavy cloud, maintaining heading, the pilot transmitted his final recorded transmission. The three planes slipped into the weather front and, within seconds, vanished from visual contact. Crews ahead and behind expected them to reappear as the cloud bank thinned, but the sky remained empty. When formation leaders attempted radio contact, the silence was absolute. At first, commanders believed the missing aircraft had simply broken formation and taken an alternate route through the storm. This had happened before, especially when icing built rapidly on wings or when turbulence forced a plane off course. But as the hours passed and no mayday calls, beacon signals, or distress flares were reported, concern turned swiftly to alarm. B-17s were rugged machines, capable of absorbing severe damage and still limping back to base. For 3 aircraft to disappear simultaneously without a single distress call was highly unusual. Historical records offer several possible explanations. Luftwaffe fighters from Jagerschwader 1 were active over northern Holland that day, conducting aggressive climbing attacks from scattered coastal airfields. Flak positions along the shoreline were thick enough to blanket entire sectors of sky. And yet, the German records from that date include no confirmed engagements with a trio of straggling bombers, nor reports of wreckage falling onto Dutch soil. Post-war analyses noted that no local residents recorded crashes consistent with 3 fortresses. Even more puzzling, no life rafts, bodies, or debris washed ashore in the weeks that followed. One surviving crewman from another bomber recalled seeing a brief metallic glint within the clouds, something that appeared and vanished too quickly to interpret. Weather specialists later suggested that the 3 aircraft might have encountered a severe icing updraft, one capable of wrenching engines into failure or forcing an uncontrollable descent. If they went down into the icy North Sea, recovery would have been unlikely. Wartime currents swiftly swallowed aircraft, scattering debris beyond traceable limits. A mission debrief from the 8th Air Force intelligence staff included a terse but haunting line, presumed lost due to weather or enemy action. Exact cause unknown. Those final 3 words, exact cause unknown, would follow the incident into history. Diaries from surviving aircrew mention the loss repeatedly, treating it almost like a warning. One waste gunner wrote, "The sea took them, or the clouds did. We'll never know which. Today, aviation historians continue to study the episode, noting that the disappearance occurred at a junction of weather systems known for sudden downdrafts and disorienting cloud formations. Yet the mystery persists because the event defies simple categorization. There were no witnesses, no gun camera footage, no last-minute SOS. Only 3 U.S. bombers that entered a storm front and never emerged. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany in the following months, the incident faded beneath the weight of larger battles and mounting casualties. But for families waiting back home, mothers, wives, brothers, the silence that followed the missing aircraft became its own kind of battlefield. Their unanswered questions formed the quiet prelude to a series of World War II air missions that would end in similarly unexplained, haunting silence, leading us directly into the next case. In the relentless heat of the North African desert during the summer of 1942, a mission was launched that would become one of the Royal Air Force's most perplexing wartime disappearances. It involved No. 208 Squadron, a reconnaissance unit tasked with gathering intelligence on Axis supply routes, a lifeline of Rommel's Afrika Korps. These missions were hazardous, flown at low altitude in single-seat P-40 Tomahawks without escort, relying entirely on speed, altitude discipline, and a pilot's ability to navigate by compass, desert landmarks, and intuition. Yet on this particular day, the squadron would lose one of its most skilled pilots, and no one would ever fully understand how. The Desert War was unlike any other theater of World War II. Crews battled not only enemy aircraft but scorching temperatures, sandstorms, and the eerie monotony of featureless terrain. Pilots often described the landscape as an endless pale ocean, one in which a single mistake or miscalculation could be fatal. The pilot assigned to this mission, Flight Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Hales, was known among his peers as calm, methodical, and exceptionally good with a map. He had flown more than 40 reconnaissance sorties since arriving in Egypt, a remarkable survival record in a squadron that regularly flew alone behind enemy lines. The mission briefing that morning was straightforward: fly along the coastal road west of Tobruk, photograph suspected fuel depots, then turn inland to confirm reports of newly constructed supply tracks. Weather reports indicated mild haze but no major sandstorms, an encouraging sign in a region where visibility could change from clear to blinding red haze in minutes. At 0900 hours, Hales took off from landing ground 123, climbing steadily into the warm, shimmering air. For the first 40 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Hales transmitted a routine position update, calm, clipped, unmistakably confident. Crossing Point B, continuing to Sector 4, he said. These sparse updates were typical for reconnaissance flights, conserving radio time while ensuring intelligence staff could track progress on paper maps marked with grease pencil. But minutes after that transmission, the radio frequencies fell quiet. No distress call, no malfunction report, no attempt to return. Hales had simply stopped communicating. Initially, Squadron Control assumed a minor equipment failure. Radio sets frequently failed under the desert's extreme temperature changes, and pilots were trained to continue the mission regardless. But when the return window closed and the Tomahawk still did not appear, concern escalated rapidly. A search was ordered, first by fellow 208 Squadron pilots, then later by South African Air Force patrols. They combed the desert along his planned route. Yet hour after hour, the sky remained empty. What made the case even more puzzling was the discovery that came 3 days later. A Bedouin shepherd found fragments of metal scattered across a remote dune field nearly 70 kilometers from Hales's assigned flight path. When British ground teams reached the site, they confirmed the markings, part of AP-40's wing assembly. But the wreckage pattern was strange. There was no evidence of fire, no large fuselage sections, and no sign of the pilot. Some pieces were half-buried, others scattered as if swept by wind or sand. The largest identifiable part was a single landing gear strut, lying at an angle that suggested a hard impact, but not necessarily a catastrophic one. Intelligence officers assembled the possibilities. Could Hales have become disoriented in the desert haze, drifting off course? Perhaps. The intense sun often distorted depth perception, and magnetic compasses sometimes fluctuated near iron-rich rock formations. But his route discipline made such a drastic deviation unlikely. Could he have been intercepted by a roving Luftwaffe patrol? Axis records for that day revealed no fighter engagements in the area and no claims against RAF reconnaissance aircraft. Moreover, the wreck site showed no clear signs of cannon hits or explosive damage. Another theory pointed to sudden engine failure. The Allison V-1710 engines powering the P-40 were reliable but vulnerable to overheating in desert operations. A coolant leak or sand ingestion could lead to abrupt loss of power. Yet even then, standard procedure would have given Hales time to radio a brief mayday. His radio remained entirely silent. A fragment of Hales's personal diary, recovered from his tent after the search ended, added a human dimension to the mystery. He wrote, "The desert hides everything. Tracks, wrecks, even men. It swallows them whole." Whether mere observation or an unsettling intuition, the line became symbolic of his disappearance. Modern historians reviewing the case propose a combination of navigational drift and mechanical failure. A subtle compass deviation, just a few degrees, could have placed Hales dozens of kilometers from his intended path by the time trouble struck. If he attempted a forced landing on a soft dune, the aircraft might have broken apart, scattering debris across the sand. High winds over the next days could then have buried key wreckage before search teams arrived. Yet the absence of the main fuselage and the pilot's remains leaves researchers with lingering questions. Desert conditions, especially in Libya's Cyrenaican region, often move sands dramatically, reshaping entire dune fields within weeks. Some believe the rest of the aircraft may now lie meters beneath shifting dunes, waiting silently in a natural tomb of sand. The RAF eventually declared Hales missing in action. His loss became one of several reconnaissance disappearances in 1942, missions where the silence that followed proved more haunting than the danger itself. As the North African campaign intensified, these unexplained vanishings raised new concerns about navigation reliability, survival chances, and the harsh unpredictability of desert warfare. And as Allied forces shifted their focus toward the Mediterranean and Italian campaigns, another type of mission, conducted not in daylight but in darkness, would generate mysteries of its own, echoing across the Pacific night. In the shadowed waters of the Western Pacific, where island chains formed natural corridors of war, the U.S. Navy launched some of its boldest nighttime operations of the conflict. These missions were flown by the legendary Black Cats, specially modified PBY Catalina flying boats painted entirely in matte black, designed to vanish into the tropical darkness. Their job was simple in description but perilous in execution: track Japanese convoys, provide illumination for torpedo attacks, and deliver covert supplies to Allied coast watchers operating deep behind enemy lines. Yet in the summer of 1944, one of these Black Cat patrols departed its island base and slipped into the night, never to return. The aircraft belonged to Patrol Squadron VP-34, stationed at Ngesibus and operating across the Palau Islands. Their flying boats were slow but versatile, able to skim low over the ocean or climb high to avoid detection. The crew of the missing Catalina was among the most experienced in the squadron. Lieutenant James T. Mercer, a calm, steady pilot with over 500 flight hours in the theater, led the mission. He and his men had grown accustomed to the hazards of nighttime flying, sudden squalls, deceptive cloud banks, and the ever-present risk of Japanese searchlights sweeping upward from island fortifications. Their assignment on the night of July 17, 1944 began like many before it. Intelligence intercepted Japanese radio traffic, suggesting a small convoy movement from Babel Dabe toward the Philippine Sea. If true, the convoy would be within range of U.S. submarines and carrier groups, but only if its exact position could be confirmed. Mercer's Black Cat was tasked with locating the ships, shadowing them undetected, and transmitting coordinates back to Navy Command. The crew loaded flares, extra fuel, and updated navigation charts, routine preparation for a mission that might last 12 hours or more. At 2,310 hours, Mercer lifted off from the calm lagoon waters. The PBY climbed slowly into a moonless sky, its engines droning evenly as the lights of the base fell behind. According to their initial radio log, the first 2 hours were uneventful. The sea was calm, visibility fair, and enemy activity light. At 0113 hours, navigator Ensign Robert Yates reported sighting 2 faint silhouettes, possibly fishing vessels or advanced elements of a convoy. Mercer acknowledged the report and turned eastward to investigate. At 0146 hours, the Catalina transmitted a brief but clear message. Visual contact confirmed. 3 vessels moving northwest. Continuing shadowing run. This was exactly the type of fine Navy intelligence hoped for. Commands were relayed for the Black Cat to maintain distance and prepare for a longer reconnaissance track. The crew was alert, coordinated, ready. And then the radio fell silent. No distress call. No garbled transmission. No further updates on convoy movement. When Mercer failed to check in at the scheduled 0230 report window, the duty officer assumed temporary interference or evasive radio discipline, common when operating near suspected enemy positions. But as dawn arrived and no return was recorded, VP 34 officials initiated a search effort. Several other Catalinas and a pair of PB-4Y privateers were dispatched along Mercer's assumed flight path. Radar sweeps scanned the coastal waters, while U.S. submarines operating near Palau were informed to watch for flares or debris. Nothing surfaced. American analysts immediately considered the threat of Japanese night fighters. By mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had begun deploying J-1N-1 Gecko twin-engine interceptors, some equipped with upward-firing cannons adapted specifically to engage slow-moving Allied patrol aircraft. Yet operational records from Japanese sources compiled after the war revealed no night fighter activity in the Palau sector on the night of Mercer's flight. Moreover, no Japanese unit claimed an aerial victory during that time frame. Another possibility was anti-aircraft fire. Palau's islands were heavily fortified with naval guns and smaller caliber AA weapons. A Black Cat flying too close to the coastline might have risked being hit without warning. But such an engagement typically produced at least a fragment of communication, a clipped mayday, a shouted position, even a burst of static. Mercer's crew transmitted nothing. Some naval historians suggest a sudden squall may have overtaken the patrol. Tropical storms in the region often formed rapidly, creating violent downdrafts and extreme turbulence. A flying boat, heavy with fuel, could have stalled or suffered structural damage. If it hit the water at night, the impact could have been catastrophic. The PBY's large wings and hollow hull structure might have broken apart instantly, sinking quickly in deep ocean waters. With no moonlight and no nearby observers, the event could have passed entirely unnoticed. Yet the most puzzling detail remains that final, confident radio message. The crew had eyes on their target and were executing standard shadowing procedures. Nothing in the transmission suggested distress, equipment failure, or sudden weather anomalies. They were doing exactly what Black Cats had done successfully dozens of times before. Years later, a retired Navy radio man who served in the region recalled an unusual but unverifiable rumor, one suggesting that unidentified Japanese barges equipped with improvised anti-aircraft guns may have been operating independently to protect supply routes. These makeshift vessels, lightly documented and often omitted from formal records, could have posed a fatal threat to a low-flying Catalina attempting to maintain covert observation. But with no wreckage ever found, the theory remains speculative. Today, the disappearance of Mercer's crew is preserved in squadron logs, naval archives, and the memories of surviving Black Cat veterans. Their mission highlights not only the bravery of nighttime reconnaissance pilots, but also the deep uncertainties of Pacific warfare, vast distances, unpredictable weather, and an enemy whose tactics were constantly evolving. The silence that followed their radio call became another thread in the tapestry of World War II air mysteries. And as Allied operations intensified in Europe in early 1945, even elite units like Britain's 617 Squadron, famed for the Dambusters raid, found that not all missions ended with clear answers. By early 1945, the air war over Europe had entered its most intense and unforgiving phase. Allied air superiority was nearly complete, but German defenses, especially flak batteries and night fighter units, remained lethal obstacles for crews flying deep into the shrinking territory of the Third Reich. Within this turbulent environment, one of the RAF's most elite formations, No. 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, was called upon to execute a precision strike against a rail junction feeding vital supply lines toward the Rhine. The mission would be remembered not for its success, but for the unexplained disappearance of a veteran Lancaster and its celebrated crew. February 22, 1945, began with a briefing that set an unmistakably urgent tone. Intelligence reported that a heavily protected railway point near Bielefeld was enabling rapid German reinforcement against the advancing British Second Army. To cripple this artery, 617 Squadron was chosen for their mastery of pinpoint bombing. Their Avro Lancasters, modified to carry the massive 12,000-pound tallboy bombs, were some of the most sophisticated and stable platforms of the war. The crew of Lancaster PB-456, led by Flight Lieutenant Graham Ellison, was among the most respected. Ellison had completed more than 24 sorties with the squadron and was known for meticulous planning and calm under pressure. Weather remained the largest concern. As crews studied synoptic charts pinned to the operations board, meteorologists warned of icing conditions over the Rhine Valley. A cold front was descending from the northeast, causing rapid temperature fluctuations at medium altitude. Still, the forecast labeled conditions acceptable, and the mission proceeded. At 1,630 hours, Ellison's Lancaster roared down the runway at Woodhall Spa and climbed steadily into a dull winter sky. The formation turned southeast, engines humming in tight synchronization. Initial reports indicated everything was proceeding according to plan. As the squadron crossed into Belgian airspace, a layer of broken cloud formed beneath them, but visibility above remained good. Gunners scanned for night fighters operating out of the remnants of German airfields, but none appeared. At 1812 hours, Ellison's flight engineer transmitted a routine update. Light turbulence. Forming up for approach. The Lancaster began its descent to bomb release altitude, adjusting speed to maintain precision. Approaching the Rhine, the weather shifted abruptly. Crews later described the scene as entering a wall of white. Moisture-laden air, mixed with freezing winds, triggered rapid ice buildup on the leading edges of wings. Some aircraft briefly struggled to maintain lift before emerging from the cloud layer. One Lancaster reported hearing intense static through their intercom, a common sign of electrical interference caused by ice crystals. Moments later, the squadron leader instructed the formation to widen spacing and avoid the worst of the cloud pockets. Then, a terse message came from Ellison's aircraft. Minor icing. Adjusting throttle. His voice was steady, controlled, nothing out of the ordinary for a seasoned pilot. But seconds after that transmission, PB-456 slipped out of visual contact. The aircraft behind it, flying at slightly higher altitude, reported losing sight not because of flak or enemy fighters, but because the Lancaster simply faded back into the clouds. When the squadron dropped below the weather layer to begin their bomb run, Ellison's aircraft was no longer present. No mayday. No request for assistance. No mechanical report. The Lancaster had vanished somewhere between the cloud bank and the approach vector. The bombing run proceeded with the remaining crews, and a tallboy bomb delivered by another Lancaster famously destroyed the Bielefeld viaduct, one of the squadron's final wartime achievements. But during the tense hours that followed, when the formation returned to home base, the absence of PB-456 became unmistakably clear. As ground crews took their positions and counted aircraft shaping into the landing pattern, they quickly realized one was missing. Initially, RAF command considered several plausible causes. The most immediate theory pointed to severe icing. The Lancaster, heavy with ordnance, could have suffered an abrupt stall if ice accumulated on the wings or blocked carburetor intakes. Yet meticulous post-war research into weather reports suggested the icing was significant but survivable. Other Lancasters encountered similar conditions and recovered. Another possibility was enemy action. Although Luftwaffe night fighter units were drastically reduced by early 1945, several Gruppen were still operational in Western Germany, including units flying Ju-88s equipped with upward-firing Schrägmusik cannons. These fighters often attacked from beneath, leaving bomber crews unaware until the moment of impact. But Luftwaffe claim records for that night show no confirmed kills in the Bielefeld sector. Flak also could not be ruled out. German anti-aircraft defenses remained formidable around major infrastructure. A well-placed burst could have crippled PB-456. Yet again, no eyewitnesses reported a fireball, falling debris, or a sudden flare, common indicators of a Lancaster being struck. The squadron flying just minutes behind Ellison's plane saw nothing. The most confounding discovery came decades later when wartime charts were cross-referenced with search and rescue logs. The area where PB-456 likely vanished included several wide river bends and heavily forested slopes. In February 1945, temperatures were near freezing and river levels high. If the Lancaster entered a steep, uncontrolled descent, it could have crashed into the Rhine or a flooded tributary. Heavy debris might have settled deep in the riverbed or become embedded in silt. Yet without a confirmed crash site, the fate of Ellison and his crew remains unresolved. Their names are etched into the Runnymede Memorial, honoring airmen with no known graves. For 617 Squadron, the loss was a painful reminder that even at the height of Allied momentum, the skies over Germany could swallow an aircraft without warning. The mystery of PB-456 would linger, carrying the same haunting silence shared by many unexplained wartime air losses. And far from Europe, in the mountains of New Guinea, another Allied mission would confront nature's raw violence in a disappearance, just as unsettling. The air war over New Guinea was unlike any other combat theater in World War II. Here, towering mountains rose abruptly from dense jungle, weather systems formed in minutes, and valleys funneled turbulent winds like natural wind tunnels. Pilots of the U.S. 5th Air Force often said the island itself felt alive, an unpredictable force as dangerous as any Japanese fighter. Within this volatile environment, a disappearance occurred that would trouble Allied commanders for years: the sudden loss of a B-25 Mitchell bomber during a low-level strike mission through the Owens-Stanley Range. No engines sputtering on the radio, no flare arcs through the clouded sky, just silence, swift and absolute. The date was October 9, 1943. At a forward airstrip near Port Moresby, crews from the 38th Bomb Group, the famed Sunsetus, prepared for a high-risk attack on Japanese positions along the north coast. Intelligence indicated that enemy supply barges were moving west from Madong, using coastal inlets for cover. The 38th was ordered to intercept them using their hallmark tactic: low-level strafing runs so close to the waves that propellers kicked up seawater. Such missions demanded nerve, precision, and flawless teamwork. The crew assigned to aircraft 12416, call sign Copperhead 4, was among the most seasoned. Their pilot, Captain Edward L. Mason, had logged dozens of sorties over New Guinea's weather-plagued terrain and was known for his steady hand. At the morning briefing, weather officers issued a warning that would later haunt investigators. A large storm front was forming along the central mountain spine. While forecasts suggested it would dissipate by midday, there was a risk of sudden cloud buildup on the return flight. Mason nodded but appeared unconcerned. Storm cells were so frequent in New Guinea that crews often accepted them as part of the operational landscape. At 0940 hours, Copperhead 4 lifted off, joining a formation of B-25s heading northeast. The outbound flight unfolded smoothly. Crews descended to treetop height as they approached the coast, roaring above the emerald canopy at speeds exceeding 230 miles per hour. The attack itself was textbook. Enemy barges were located near Hansa Bay, and the Mitchells unleashed a barrage of .50 caliber fire. Mason's crew strafed two anchored vessels before banking sharply inland. It was the return journey that changed everything. To avoid known Japanese anti-aircraft pockets along the coast, the formation turned southward into the Owens-Stanley Range, a jagged barrier of peaks reaching more than 13,000 feet into the sky. Afternoon storms often brewed in these mountains, but the pilots hoped to slip through ahead of the worst weather. As they approached the first ridgeline, clouds thickened with startling speed, forming towering walls of fog. The lead aircraft signaled the formation to climb. Radio logs show that the pilots began exchanging altitude updates, confirming oxygen flow and engine temperatures. At 1,234 hours, Mason's voice came over the radio. Visibility dropping. Adjusting course east. Should clear in 2 minutes. His tone was calm, routine, typical of a man who had navigated these mountains before. That transmission was his last. Moments later, the formation emerged from the drifting cloud bank. Copperhead 4 was no longer with them. At first, flight leader Major Collins assumed Mason had swung wide and would rejoin within minutes. But as the remaining B-25s descended toward Port Moresby, the silence grew heavier. Search aircraft were dispatched almost immediately. Additional B-25s, P-39 Airacobras, and even an Australian Hudson. They flew grid patterns over the ridges, valleys, and river basins where Mason's plane was last known to be. The terrain, however, was unforgiving. Mists clung to cliffs, and cloud shadows swallowed entire ravines. Not a single flare, reflection, or piece of debris was sighted. For 2 weeks, the search continued. Teams on foot, including Australian infantry and Papua New Guinean trackers, attempted to penetrate the jungle. They battled leeches, crushing humidity, and visibility so poor that a man could lose sight of his own boots. Ultimately, the mission was abandoned. The jungle had won. Investigators pieced together several theories. One possibility was terrain-induced downdraft. The Owen Stanley Range produced violent air currents capable of pulling even heavy aircraft downward. A sudden plunge into thick cloud could have disoriented Mason or reduced reaction time to mere seconds. If the B-25 struck a ridge or valley wall, dense foliage might have concealed wreckage completely. Another theory focused on mechanical failure. The B-25's twin Wright R-2600 engines were robust, but susceptible to carburetor icing in moist, chilled air. Inside the cloud layer, temperature could drop sharply enough to choke airflow. If both engines suffered power loss, Mason might have attempted an emergency landing in the jungle, a desperate maneuver with slim odds of survival. A third possibility suggested that Mason, navigating through shifting fog, drifted off the intended course. A deviation of just a few degrees could place an aircraft above an uncharted ravine or facing a cliff masked by clouds. But one detail remains particularly unnerving: the lack of any distress signal. Even a few seconds of warning could have produced a clipped transmission. Mason was experienced, disciplined, and trained to communicate in emergencies. His silence suggests an event so abrupt that no reaction was possible. Over the decades, the jungles of New Guinea have revealed many wartime crash sites, but Copperhead 4 remains missing. Some historians believe the wreckage lies deep within a narrow valley where tree canopies exceed 200 feet. Others suggest it may rest on a high shelf or ridge still too remote for survey teams to access. For the families of the crew, the absence of answers became its own enduring wound. Their names, carved into memorials across Australia and the United States, symbolize the risk faced by airmen battling not only an enemy, but a landscape that swallowed machines whole. This loss, defined by sudden clouds, shifting winds, and a mountain range infamous for claiming aircraft, set the stage for yet another wartime disappearance. As the war neared its end, Allied intelligence analysts began to see patterns forming across these missions, patterns that would come to define the final mystery. As the Second World War drew to its bruising conclusion in 1945, Allied intelligence branches on both sides of the Atlantic began compiling vast datasets of lost aircraft, mission reports, last radio logs, weather summaries, radar traces, and eyewitness accounts. In the flood of operational records, analysts noticed a pattern that was both unsettling and oddly consistent: a cluster of air missions that had vanished without distress calls, witnesses, or confirmed wreckage. These disappearances spanned continents, over European cities, in the deserts of North Africa, across the Pacific, and deep within the jungles of New Guinea. And although wartime chaos could explain many losses, some cases resisted neat categorization. They offered no final clue, no definitive answer. Only silence. By April 1945, the intelligence cell at Allied Air Forces Europe, housed in a cluttered office in Bushy Park outside London, began cross-referencing unusual loss reports from the previous 3 years. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter, an analyst known for her meticulous eye, pored over mission logs that described aircraft simply failing to return, without combat damage evidence. One note involving a 1943 B-17 case caught her attention. Entered cloud, not seen again. Another, written by a frustrated RAF officer, read, "No radar echo. No enemy claim. Weather marginal." Carter began marking patterns on a wall map with small strips of colored tape: North Sea, Tobruk Desert, Palau, the Rhine Valley, and the Owens-Stanley Range. On the surface, these events had nothing in common. Different aircraft types, different forces, different terrain, different years. But Carter recognized the shared denominators: unstable weather systems, narrow operational margins, and the lethal reality of flying in environments where one error or malfunction could erase an aircraft in seconds. And yet, these were experienced crews. Many had survived earlier missions more dangerous than the ones that claimed them. Why had their luck, or capability, failed at those precise moments? An intelligence circular issued in May 1945 attempted to answer that question. It cited several contributing factors. First, rapid weather evolution. During the war, forecasts were often limited by crude instrumentation and incomplete atmospheric observations. Storms, turbulence, or icing layers frequently developed faster than predicted. Second, the limits of aircraft stress tolerance. Aircrews push machines to the edge, overloading engines, diving at low altitude, or climbing through icy clouds. Third, operational secrecy. Some missions were designed to avoid radio chatter, leaving crews vulnerable in emergencies. Fourth, the environment: deserts, oceans, tropical jungles, capable of consuming wreckage with astonishing efficiency. But none of these explanations resolve the cases where aircraft vanished in conditions considered routine, or within minutes of confident, unremarkable radio transmissions. Nor did they explain why some aircraft disappeared in places later searched with intensity and precision. A revealing diary entry came from an American radar operator stationed at Aishima Airfield, who wrote, "The Pacific is too wide. Europe too cloudy. Africa too empty. You could lose 1,000 planes and still never know where they fell." His words captured the scale of the problem. The war was fought across a planet-sized battlefield. Yet among the analysts, a quieter conclusion emerged, one rarely shared beyond classified channels. Many aircraft vanished because, in critical moments, multiple small failures combined: a shift in wind, a subtle navigational error, a momentary lapse in visibility, a mechanical issue too subtle to detect in advance. In peacetime, these incidents might have resulted in forced landings or controlled ditchings. But during World War II, with heavy fuel loads, hostile territory, strict radio discipline, and navigational uncertainty, such events often became fatal cascades. The silence that followed was not mystical. It was the sound of machines pushed beyond their survival limits. As post-war investigations continued, families received what little comfort the military could offer: formal letters, mentions in casualty lists, a name inscribed on a memorial wall. Many hoped for the discovery of wreckage, a final confirmation, a tangible link to a loved one's last moments. But in case after case, the answers never came. Even decades later, jungle expeditions, underwater surveys, and historical research failed to find the missing crews of the desert, the sea, the mountains, or the clouds. And yet, these absences hold meaning. They illuminate the risks faced by airmen who operated at the intersection of early aviation technology and vast, unforgiving environments. They remind us that victory in World War II came at the cost of thousands whose final missions ended not in fiery battles, but in quiet, unexplained disappearance. In modern times, These stories have sparked renewed interest among historians, search and recovery teams, and aviation researchers. Some wrecks have been found, pieces of aluminum glinting in remote jungles or sandy ridgelines, but many remain undiscovered. The mysteries endure because they reflect both the known and unknown boundaries of human flight in wartime. And so, as the war ended and the world counted its losses, the Allied intelligence report on unexplained air missions concluded with a single somber sentence: some answers may never be recovered, for they lie beyond the reach of maps, in places where time holds its dead. That sentence, stark and honest, became the final chapter in the story of these 5 missions that flew into the clouded edges of human capability and vanished into silence.